Sadly, my father went bankrupt, and I got to see on the front line what happens during a really bad recession, because retailers got hit first, and then my father got hit, and he died 2 years later, and I'm sure that contributed to his early death. So that taught me a lot about sitting on the front line. I've been on the front line now 4 recessions. This recession that's coming up will be my 5th, every one of them very different. But it has given me a lot of empathy, as well as highlighted the importance of strategy and reminded me that millionaires are made during recessions, not necessarily during booms. It all comes down to one thing: planning.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Money Matters podcast. This is PJ Patterson, and I'm joined today by Kahla Gerard of Vision Works Property Consultants. She is a buyer's agent, and we're going to have a chat with her today about buyer's agents, the property market, and what's going on in Australia, among other things. Kahla, welcome to the Money Matters podcast.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to kick off with a little bit about you. You've got a very interesting background, and so tell us a little bit about your early years, maybe of learning about property, and because I think you mentioned to me before that your father was in property development a little bit. So tell us what got you started in the property game and in the property industry.
So my dad was a lawyer in France, and but he was a Holocaust refugee. So when he came to Australia, he already spoke 7 languages, but needed to speak English. And so while he was learning English, he was a postie. And then, like a lot of refugees, you start from the bottom again. And then he got into real estate. And Dad wasn't going to stop for too long in real estate because he had a very strategic mind. But I literally grew up, these are the days where you could door knock for listings. And so my father literally pushed me around in a pram and door knocked for listings, because he found out he got more listings with me there than without, because back then anybody who spoke with an accent was looked down upon. Australia has matured a lot since then. So, but then later on, he started doing property developments, first buying whole buildings. And so as the daughter of an immigrant, we would come home from school, change out of our uniforms and go and work on the property till 12 at night. And then later on, he changed the laws. He was proactive in changing the laws in New South Wales so corner petrol stations could be redeveloped. And he went around and put options on them, then got a BA and a DA, and then sold them before the option expired, which is why there's so many ugly, I'm so sorry, buildings on corner streets around New South Wales. And then later on, he made so much money doing that, that later on he ended up building the shopping centre in Bondi Junction and Parramatta. And he finally got to a position where he felt secure financially. But then we had the recession we had to have. And back then, you could only secure commercial loans through lawyers. And while I was paying 17.5% to keep my mortgage afloat and holding down 2 jobs, he was paying 40% plus. And retailers were the first not to pay their rent. So unfortunately, my father held on too long, ended up selling it to Frank Lowy, who turned it into Westfield. And sadly, my father went bankrupt, and I got to see on the front line what happens during a really bad recession, because retailers got hit first, and then my father got hit, and he died 2 years later, and I'm sure that contributed to his early death. So that taught me a lot about sitting on the front line. I've been on the front line now 4 recessions. This recession that's coming up will be my 5th, every one of them very different. But it has given me a lot of empathy, as well as highlighted the importance of strategy and reminded me that millionaires are made during recessions, not necessarily during booms. It all comes down to one thing: planning. Yeah.
Is that property millionaires are made in recessions?
No. I think anybody who, I mean, for me, it's property because that's my DNA. My sister is a share trader. So it really comes down to what your specialty is and who your team that you trust, who surrounds you to give you the kind of strategic advice you need. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm sure we'll get more into that. And the fact that you brought up the R word, the dreaded R word, recession, is interesting. We might have time to talk a little bit about economics and maybe some thoughts on that.
I will say that I actually ended up becoming a financial planner for a few years and then a mortgage broker for 12 years. But really my passion's always been property, and I just surrendered to that.
Yeah.
But what it does is it gives me incredible respect for professionals in different areas and how they should work and how perhaps they shouldn't be working as well. Yeah.
I want to get to that in one second, but I did want to ask you what your sort of earliest memory or your earliest property investment or property transaction was, whether that was for yourself or even professionally. What's your earliest memory of that?
Oh, well, for myself, it's very embarrassing because when I was in my early 20s, did I listen to my father? No. I bought a property down in Jindabyne because I love skiing. And it was a terrible acquisition. I learned a lot. And then when I came back from America, I had a bit of money in my back pocket. And my father suggested that I buy a tiny little, almost two-bedroom apartment overlooking Sydney Harbour in Potts Point for $32,000. But I didn't listen to him again, and I went and bought something else. So, it's really about listening to people who know what they're doing and leaning forward and learning rather than assuming, as my youth did, assuming I knew better, which clearly I didn't. Yeah.
I probably would have waited to ask you this question, but because you brought it up, I think it's an interesting one, an interesting topic to explore, and that is, do you get younger buyers coming to you to get advice around property, and how do you treat them?
That's a really interesting question. There are some really savvy young people out there. They've had a better financial education than my generation did. And then I get a lot of very savvy younger buyers who are rookies, but they're thirsty to learn and they're wonderful to work with, and they usually ask really great questions. And then I get people who are in their late 40s, 50s who are panicking because they haven't really done anything strategic. They've been very focused on bringing up their family and paying off their home loan. Unfortunately, we don't get taught financial intelligence at school. It is really heartbreaking to see that still not being taught to this day, because that is a life skill. And you shouldn't wait till you get to your late 40s before you actually lean forward and start getting the advice that you need. Yeah. And then I get everything in between.
Yeah. I agree with that sentiment. I think, and this is not an Australian thing, it's certainly in the US and probably other parts of the world where young people traditionally didn't get great financial education at school. They got it from their parents or someone else. Now, of course, we have the internet, which is ubiquitous. It's in everyone's pocket. And sadly, there's a lot of, we call them finfluencers now, but people that have no license, no responsibility, no experience, and yet they have an opinion on everything. That's very dangerous territory. Not the topic for this particular conversation, but it's worth bringing that out right up front, right? To say that you do need to really deal with experts when you're getting advice or thinking about making a big decision like buying property. You mentioned that you had some training as you were a trained financial advisor, mortgage broker, before you got into sort of becoming a buyer's advocate or buyer's agent. What did having those two roles, how did they help you with what you do now as a buyer's agent?
Well, before I went into financial planning, I was actually working in medicine for 16 years. And I went through a terrible divorce. I knew how to make money, but I didn't know how to have money work for me. So I didn't know who to trust, which is why I went and did financial planning. I had no interest in being in that industry. But then I became hooked and fascinated because every time I lifted a cover, there was another question that I needed answering. What I learned from financial planning was that, oh God, so much. I am passionate about diversification. The financial planning industry needs an overhaul. It's probably quite contentious that I said that, but there are a lot of KPIs in financial planning, especially for financial planners who work for some of the larger lenders and groups around. And I do think financial planning, like every industry right now with AI influence, and we were talking about that briefly before, is going through a revolution, not an evolution. And this is an opportunity for us to pick it up and really look at it from different angles, as well as ensure that people have the proper training. I know that you can't operate as a financial planner unless you have that proper training, but a lot of financial planners that I see are processors, just like a lot of mortgage brokers and accountants. So I think we're entering into a time, and buyer's agents, I think we're entering into a time where you can learn processing on the internet. You're entering into a time now where you need strategists. So yes, wealthy people are only as good as the people around them. But I have been very lucky to work with some wealthy people. And what I have learned by working with them is they have a round table of really savvy people. And they ask great questions and they listen and they encourage contentiousness because you're getting different opinions. And it doesn't mean that one opinion is right. Maybe there is something that we hadn't considered. And then they will make their decision. They're always at the driver's wheel, but they recognize what their professional advisors bring to the table. Saying that, a lot of people come to me with barbecue advisors, and I choose not to work with them.
Right,
Yeah.
So you don't even try to re-educate or help them with that, you just kind of say, hard pass.
I think people need to actually, when you have someone who thinks they're an expert, they need to be wanting to learn. It's not my job to change their minds. You know, if they're coming to me and they're going, perhaps I don't have all the answers, and having worked in a few different industries, I certainly know I don't have all the answers. But sometimes when you know a little bit, you think you know more than you do. And so if they're interested in learning more and perhaps seeing things from a different perspective, then I'm really interested in working with them and answering any questions they have. But if they come in with an agenda that there is one system and one system only, despite varying goals and circumstances and market conditions, then probably they need to go off and find out for themselves whether it works. Yeah.
I love that. I love what you just said there in that approach. I've become very fond in my later career years of saying to people, I don't know.
Yeah.
And I mean, you're sitting in front of a bookshelf in my office that is loaded with books, and a lot of them are about different things: math, probability, leadership, etc. And one of the common things that I've learned from a lot of that stuff is it's actually okay to not know something, and is the thirst for curiosity, or then the questions that you then ask to get to an answer or to discover the truth, whatever that is the more important thing
100%.
than having the answer.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So
I love
that.
what you said, because really now I've learned this now over many years. It's really always the quality of questions asked.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
the sign of true intelligence.
The quality of the question determines the quality of the answer.
Exactly.
Well, let's pivot now. Thank you for running through all of that history. I think that's fascinating. I'm sure we could spend another 30 minutes talking about that. But I do want to get to what buyer's agents are and do, because this is why we're here as a buyer's agent. Let's just maybe talk about what are the basics of buyer's agents. What do they actually do?
Before I answer that question, I should say that I lived in America for a long time. My whole family are still in America, and buyer's agents in America are the norm. You know, you don't think of necessarily securing your own place. You would go through a buyer's agent. In Australia, it's different. We work in a country where everybody in Australia are property experts. And I go, oh, well, that's really interesting. What are the rules of property investing? And then I see a blank look. And I go, well, in actuality, we can't drive a car unless we know the rules of the road. So hopefully buyer's agents are people who understand legislation, who understand the right questions to ask when they're going through their due diligence, when they're sourcing property. They understand negotiation skills, and they don't forget that they're hired by the buyer and that they work for the buyer, because that can get a little murky at times. Yeah.
Let's talk about those two things. I think that's really important. So the buyer's agent and a seller's agent, two entirely different things. You've just defined what a buyer's agent does or should be doing, which is representing only the person they work for, which is that person that's engaged them to go and source a property for them, versus the seller's agent, which works for the vendor. And it's almost like these two people are almost at opposite ends of the spectrum. The seller's agent is trying to extract the most value out of you as a buyer, and maybe as a buyer's agent, maybe you're not trying to get the best price, but you're certainly trying to make sure that, I would imagine that whatever property transaction you're looking at, that you fully understand what you're getting yourself into as a buyer. So uncovering things, perhaps. Maybe just take that and run with it. Elaborate on what I've just said there.
Well, it can get a little murky because buyer's agents are a very new modality in Australia. And I actually think that with AI may replace sales agents, but I think it's going to be very hard for AI to replace buyer's agents, at least in the short term, if they're good. The problem is in Australia, we are still being regulated, the property industry. And so some buyer's agents may only source property from certain real estate agents, and they can be under table agreements there, even though it's illegal. Or they can call themselves buyer's agents but work for a research house. And this is where this might be contentious. So research houses, a lot of them, not all of them, but the bulk of them, that has been my experience, is that they will approach developers, for instance, and they will go, in order to get a larger commission, we will sell a parcel of properties. Some of them will be south-facing, overlooking a driveway. Some will be mediocre properties, and one or two may be really quality properties, and they have to represent them to the buyers as if they're all the same. So to me, that's not working for the buyer. That's working for the vendor. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of murkiness in the environment, and I will be one of the first to see that being cleaned up. Mm. Yeah.
Yes, there is a lot of murkiness in the environment. I don't know, I mean, our phones are in the room, so after I say this, you'll probably be getting more of these ads. But I get these ads all the time in my Facebook feed, which is around, stock that's available and people that are saying they're buyer's agents. And I hadn't really thought of it that way previously, but they do represent maybe a small group of property developers or people with stock to sell. And they might be a buyer's agent in that respect, but they really are just a seller's agent looking for buyers, I suppose,
That's
right? And as you say, they have those commissions and things that are quite substantial. I know the range can be between 4 and 8%, maybe even higher of the property price. And maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But before we go too far down into that rabbit hole, you did mention AI, which is, of course, on everybody's lips these days with how it's transforming lots of industries. So at this stage, I guess from a buyer's agent perspective, you don't think it will really have a massive impact because of the strategy piece and the consultation piece that you would be doing with buyers? Like maybe just run us through a little bit of your process around how you do things. And
well, I work a little bit differently from a lot of buyer's agents because I got trained in financial planning and then I got trained in mortgage broking, and I've learned that most people I'm going to buy a property, and then they go and find the property. Whereas for me, it's you plan first, you structure your finance first, and you structure your ownership structures first. And then once that's structured, then you go and source the property, and you source appropriate property to the goals and conditions and the market conditions as well. Can you say that question again? I got lost down a little wormhole.
That's okay, yeah. So the question is around AI and how it may or may not transform buyers' agencies.
Yes.
And I guess, your process and how you think maybe a human is going to not be replaced by AI in the process of what you do.
Well, first, I think a really important distinction is that I think it's great we have AI. And I think it's an education piece. But as I keep getting reminded by AI, I can't rely on it. And it's only as good as the questions we ask again. And a good example of that is I was looking at property in the Southern Highlands, and it gave me a short list of 6 properties that were fitting my criteria, and they were so far off what I was looking for. So it was a really interesting exercise. So with people who are wanting to work with the buyer's agents, please use AI, because that's a way of making sure nothing has been missed. But as far as what a buyer's agent, I think buyer's agents who are strategists and understand structuring of finance and understand structuring of ownership and really understand how to read the industry to find the appropriate property. And that takes sometimes years, because if I'm sourcing existing property, I grew up on construction sites. I know what to look for. And even I had a role once upon a time where I did due diligence on all the developers around Australia. So I got to learn who was good, who wasn't. I grew up with developers. So when I go and look at new property, there's a lot of checks and balances that I go through before I would even bring a client to that property. And these are checks and balances you're not going to find on AI. These are something that you have to have feet on the ground. You have to have known the history of those developers. You have to walk around the building sites and see how the construction workers are working. And these are all intangibles. And I don't know, I mean, maybe AI will get there, but I don't know a true way of AI being able to find that information that will give people peace of mind. I mean, I have never had, with new property, I do existing, new, off the plan, commercial, whatever is appropriate, but I've never had a developer fall over financially or not finish a construction. And that comes back to one thing and one thing only, and that's due diligence. And so, it's a lot. Yeah.
Talking about due diligence, what are some of the things that are key DD things that you do? I mean, obviously there'd be a massive laundry list which you don't have to go through, but sort of maybe one of the top things that you would be looking for.
Quality, if we're talking off the plan, which everybody's nervous about, and for good reason, but not all developers are bad. There's some unbelievably impressive developers out there. But for instance, really quality developers, when they know they're going to proceed with a development, they buy all the construction materials and store them so they don't have supply issues and increasing costs in construction. That is key. They also, I want to make sure a builder has been assigned, a quality builder has been assigned to them. Now, a builder is going to do more financial due diligence on the developer than I could possibly do. So that is a real sign to look out for. There's a whole lot of other checks and balances, but as we head into a recession, and as we've got the budget now, which says that off-the-plan properties are going to continue to have the capital gains tax advantages and the tax deductions, etc., more and more people are going to lean towards sourcing off the plan. I feel very uncomfortable with some of the decisions that they made during the budget. But off the plan will be the go-to for people who want to continue to build their portfolio, but all the more reason to find a quality buyer's agent who really knows what they're doing and will go through the due diligence so that they're not exposed, especially during a potential recession, which we seem to be on the cusp of. Yeah.
So that was off the plan. What about existing property? So, I mean, it sounds like off the plan is probably, that's more your investor type that you're referring to, building a portfolio. What if you get a client that's just saying, I want you to find me my next family home?
Okay. So my specialty is building investment portfolios.
Okay.
I do source owner-occupier homes, the principal place of residence, usually for clients who I've built a portfolio for and they've gone, please, can you go and find me something? But I think I used this example with you once, which was, and I'll give you a good example. Recently, I was sourcing a principal place of residence for some clients, and it took me 6 months to source the property they wanted. It literally had every single thing on their checklist, except the stove was green. And so this is the intangible of when you're dealing with people buying their home. So I said, look, change the stove. But they took 2 days to decide, in which time someone else had gazumped them, and they lost that property, and it took us several months longer to find a place because they kept comparing it to the place that we found before. So I tend not to do that. And as an ex-financial planner, ex-mortgage broker, my specialty is clearly building property portfolios. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to know, because I suppose even within buyer's agency, you can specialize, is the point, right? Is that maybe there are buyer's agents out there that just look for people's next home.
And there's some very good ones too.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So what kind of client then, I guess in your case it would be that investor client, is going to get the most value out of working with a person like you, because you've got the background, the knowledge, particularly in that construction industry, off the plan. Is it stuff that's newly completed as well? Same sort of deal, or do you just focus on the off the plan?
What I found with newly completed, for instance in Queensland, if it's newly completed and not sold, it's for 2 reasons. One was it wasn't very good to start with, or the second one was that the developer held it because they saw the market going up in value and then they could make the most of it at that point. So that's in Queensland. In Victoria, for instance, there's a stamp duty exemption. So Victoria has the most expensive stamp duty in Australia. There's been a stamp duty exemption that has been going on for nearly 2 years, and they've extended it for another 6 months. And that gives you an exemption for apartments and townhouses close to infrastructure in CBD areas, basically you can have a huge saving of many, many tens of thousands of dollars. So it's about learning the legislation in each state and where to invest and how to build diversification as well.
Good. That's fantastic. Yeah, I think, again, getting a specialist in for anything in particular, whatever it is that you're working on to do in your financial portfolio is a wise move. You said something earlier, and I wrote this down. I'm just trying to, I paused there for a second because I was trying to remember the context of which I wrote this down. Yes, okay, I remember now. You said you should know the rules of the property market, just like the rules of the road. So can you elaborate on that statement a little bit? So what are some of the rules of the property market that you adhere to and follow and advise your clients to follow?
So look, I'd say 70% of my clients come to me and they say that they want house and land, which by the way, I love house and land. But to get house and land in a great location, you need fairly deep pockets. And then the yield may be softer. So we have to work with reality. And when I ask them why house and land, and it's because they say, well, capital growth is associated with land. And that's usually when I respond with, well, if that was the case, real estate wouldn't have its catchphrase as location, location, location. So it's always location. And I think that came from my generation where you could buy, for instance, my father was offered 5 townhouses, 3-story townhouses in Paddington for $35,000 for the whole lot. Now, when I was a kid, Paddington was where you went and scored smack, heroin, and you wouldn't get a taxi going there after dark. But it's only 2 kilometres from the CBD. And my father was talking about that missed opportunity on his on his deathbed. And it was because of the location. So, whereas, you know, what did I do? I went and bought a piece of land out in Jindabyne, which was a pretty location, but there's no infrastructure, no employment clusters. And so I didn't make any money. I basically just barely kept up with CPI. So, and buying land is an expensive exercise. You really want to get it right from the get-go. So location, location, location every time. And then understanding that low vacancy rates can be an indication that it is a good location. Because there's a huge demand and lack of supply. It's not always the case, but it's a flag for you to look into it. Usually first rent goes up and capital growth follows. People miss that. And they forget that property is a medium to long-term gig. And sometimes that's why tax depreciation was such a good thing, because the first 5 years of holding a property is the most expensive. Just as depreciation ran off, then the property would start performing. It makes it harder if tax depreciation has been leveled off. And then understanding there are 4 types of residential property. There's tourist grade, which can have good yield in good boom times where people are traveling for holidays, but it actually has high turnover, which means high running costs. And usually during a downturn, because property is cyclical, you're forced to sell that property because rent is oxygen to your investment, and that's not when you want to sell. So I see tourist grade accommodation, and I'm talking Airbnbs and things like that, as being very, very high risk. I also think investment grade properties where you buy into areas which are only bought by investors or first homeowners. and you drive around those suburbs and you see the lawns haven't been kept up. It's a long way from infrastructure. The kids have got nothing to do, so there's a lot of crime. And the buildings start to run down just as the depreciations run off. And you go, why did you buy there in the first place? And I'll come back to owner-occupier quality in a moment. And then there's luxury grade, which I also deem as high risk. Because during a boom time, they're one of the first to go up. But during a recession, they're one of the first to go down. And I'm experiencing that. I live in Mossman, and a lot of the people in Mossman are seeing huge drops in the value of their property. And I'm talking up to a couple of million drops in a very short time. So they're great properties to have if they're your principal place of residence and you don't owe any money. But they're not great investments, especially in Sydney, because the yield is so soft, you know. And then there's owner-occupier, and this is the kicker. And that is, if you buy owner-occupier quality that's close to infrastructure, close to good locations and good employment, that's got double glazed windows, that has a lovely garden around it, or, you know, things like that, they're going to have a long-term appeal, and they look better with time. And when you drive around suburbs that are owner-occupied, there's a certain sense of pride. And there is a terminology for suburbs which have a lot of owner-occupier property, and they're called Beehive suburbs. So there are suburbs, Mossman's a good example again, where you grow up in that suburb, and then when you leave home, you might go somewhere else, but when you come back, you buy an apartment, and then you meet someone. This is so vanilla, I'm so sorry, because there's all these variables, but you meet someone, and then you upgrade to a townhouse, and you have 1 or 2 children. You grow out of the townhouse, you grow into a bigger house, staying in the same suburb. Then you grow into a bigger house, and then you start downsizing, and you stay in the same suburb. They're called Beehive suburbs. Those are the suburbs that you look for when you want to invest. And then when you analyze the market of who the buyers are, a few years ago when I looked, the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, said 76% of buyers are owner-occupiers. So that leaves 24% that are investors. Of that 24%, I would figure about 15% want to buy new or off the plan, particularly in today's market, because they want depreciation. So that leaves you with 9% wanting to buy your property at a bargain, because there's less buyers at the table. Why would you buy investment grade? Better to pay a slight premium, and I say slight, could be just as much as 50,000 more, and have a bit more understanding about where you're buying and have more uptake for that. Yeah.
That's interesting. We may come back to that. Funnily enough, you've just described exactly how my wife and I ended up in Belrose. Her family was there for maybe 10 years and then moved over to Beacon Hill. But same deal. When she started her career, bought a unit in Lane Cove, owner-occupied. When I met her, we lived there, started having children, outgrew that quickly, moved to a duplex in Belrose, which we didn't own, but we rented, and then bought in Belrose. And here we are 20 years later, with the same house. And so as you were telling that story, I'm like, yep, that's me. And the kids too. I mean, my children, 2 are still at home, but one has moved out, but he's moved into a unit we purchased in St. Ives, which isn't far away. And that's kind of a beehive-y sort of suburb too, I think. Yeah. But with everything that's even going on around Belrose and this Northern Beaches cluster, with the development, the significant state significant site development and all that stuff, I'd never heard that term beehive suburb before. Maybe I had, but it didn't stick with me. But I love that analogy. I think that's very interesting.
It is a really, interesting analogy because a lot of people say, look, it's just an investment. You're not going to live there. And my response is, well, why would anybody else? And you're always going to sell. You're not holding forever. So you want to sell to people who are emotionally invested. You want to have more than one lot of buyers at the table. You want at least two, if not more. And you want the flexibility of being able to sell in any market. And if you bought out in an investment area, it's likely you will not get much if you're trying to sell during a recession. So, you know, property is a medium to long-term asset, but we buy it like it's, we're share trading. We forget, you know, and that's why I go plan, structure, purchase, you know, and if you do that right, it's a no-brainer. And I've just reviewed all my clients' portfolios, and every single client has gone up in value in this market, with the exception of two, which have just held value. And this is, according to the media, a market where everything is going downwards. It's not. It's a two-tiered market.
Do you think that we always have a two-tiered market in Australia? For the most part? Is that the condition that's precedent?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the reason we introduced tax deductions to Australia is because we're a new country and we need to be able to supply accommodation to the people who are here. In Europe or other countries, you get a tax deduction for owning your own home because they're established countries. We aren't an established country and we have a supply and demand issue. And this is why I'm so disappointed by the budget, because they did not intelligently approach the supply and demand. They instead penalized people who were contributing to supply. And I think it's a very short-term approach.
It is a disappointing approach. I agree with that assessment. And I haven't spent a lot of time on the budget, but I think anytime a government applies a stick instead of a carrot, it might work in the short term, but it will backfire in the long term. Because to grow a nation's wealth, you have to produce things. And all they're really doing, I dare say, is, I think you use the word penalizing, but they're penalizing the people who have invested in property for the purpose of providing accommodation and supporting that industry. What's that going to end up doing? It might shift some of the deck chairs, so they might go, well, this isn't for me anymore, so I'm going to sell, and maybe somebody who wants to buy into the market might buy into the market, but eventually we're going to be back to where we are right now, which is with the same problem, which is a supply issue. We're not building enough. We've known that for years and years. We're just not building enough. So short term, it may not even be a short-term solve. I don't know. We'll just have to see.
Well, you know, their excuse was that they wanted to cut back on all the wealthy people taking advantage of the system. If they really wanted to do that, then they should have increased the land tax. And then I go, I was an advisor to one of the ministers for housing, and it was a really interesting learning curve for me because you know, we're building houses like they were designed yesterday. Now, most of the houses or the property I source is ecological and sustainable. You would never know that because it looks amazing. But it's future-proofing your investment. And given that it's a medium to long-term investment, why wouldn't you do that? And then I have clients who've gone, look, I want to build my own home, but I don't want to go through what these house and land projects. Right. Now, I have a perfect example of one of my clients who bought a piece of land in the Northern Beaches, and I put him in touch with an ecological sustainable project home company. It took him 2 years to get DAMBA. It took him 6 weeks to lay the slab and the electrical cables. It took him 2.5 days for the house to be finished. And it's an a global architecturally award-winning house. So that was 12 years ago. So when I mentioned that to the person I was advising, and some other options for dealing with the supply issue, instead of building the same cookie cutter house and land where you can be in the bedroom and put your hand out the window and touch the next house, which will be the slums of the future, his response was, I'm an accountant, I didn't ask for this portfolio. So if you keep approaching the same problems with the same techniques, we can't sit back and go, and Australia deserves better. Instead, we're losing all our technology for modern building techniques to China because we're not subsidizing the R&D enough in those areas. And just like every other industry, people keep looking at house and land the old way. We're going through, in this arena, a revolution as well, not an evolution. And I'm seeing it on the sites. When we began the podcast, we were talking about these amazing little microphones. You should see what's happening on construction sites. It is mind-blowing. And we're just not really waking up to this. This is not a conversation that's being had. And I love it. I love what I'm seeing. But instead, what I'm noticing the governments are doing is giving cheap money to developers without asking anything back in return. So they could be giving cheaper money to developers if they want to, but something needs to come back. Some kind of standards need to be introduced. So when I look at property, building a property portfolio, I look at it from the finance point of view. I also look at it, how is that property going to perform in the medium to long point of view? Because I want to source something that's going to get more and more rent and more value over time, not the opposite.
So just so I'm clear, because and do correct me if I'm wrong when I make this statement, but is it fair to say then that you are focusing on finding properties that an owner-occupier will eventually want to buy off of you?
So much so that, unfortunately for me, I cannot count how many times I've sourced an investment for someone, done all the planning, and then the client goes and looks at the finished product and then goes back to their ordinary home and they go, oh, why are we living here? Maybe we should live there. And that kind of means we're going to go back to square one. So yes, definitely, and it doesn't necessarily have to cost more. I've seen investment grade quality costs a lot more. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad thank you for clarifying that. I thought that's what you meant, and I have heard that from other people that I know in the property industry have talked about that dynamic of making sure that when you're buying, that you're going to be buying in an area, not that's cookie cutter and all this stuff just being thrown together or put up for investors, but actually something that an owner-occupier is going to want to occupy or would occupy because, you're going to have a much easier time selling. And of course, there are all those other factors that you've already mentioned around those types of properties.
I think COVID taught us a lot because when we went into lockdown, suddenly our local Brewster was really important. The person at the corner store was really important. Our community became more important. We didn't want to have to commute. We got used to working a bit more from home. And so where we live means a lot more than what it used to. And now we have the oil crisis, which we're only just scraping the surface of. Now, you don't want to have to get into a car and have to travel 2.5 hours to get home at the end of the day through all those tollways with that expensive diesel or petrol that you're paying for. So now more than ever, location is what people want. And people also want with COVID, for instance, I must be 15 years ago, I sourced ecological and sustainable offices. Now, during COVID, most offices were empty and went down in value. The ecological sustainable offices that I had that had cross-flow ventilation, it had atriums, it had a lot of lifestyle factors involved, they went up and up and up in value. So, it is a good example of really looking at a shifting world and investing for the future. Yeah.
I like that.
And me too.
There was an article from 2017 that was brought up in my prep work that ChatGPT did for me for this interview, where I think you were talking about the Sunshine Coast in Queensland being better value than Sydney at the time. And there was more infrastructure going and all this sort of thing. So the question is this, do you find that people have a home city or home suburb bias when they're engaging a buyer's agent, or are they open to whatever you come up with?
Sometimes. I'm going to answer that in two parts. I bought in Sunshine Coast because one of the other rules of investing is to look at where infrastructure announcements are being made. So when Sydney was booming in 2011, just before the GFC, no one wanted to go up to southeast Queensland. And yet I was looking at all this money pouring into southeast Queensland because I'm going, Brisbane recognised Hong Kong was going to close. We don't live in Australia, we live in Australasia. And Dubai has limitations, Singapore has limitations. We need to have a capital in Australia for business. So Brisbane started giving incentives to overseas companies. Then they went after all the sporting events and they put $235 billion into Brisbane, and they've added to that since then. And then Sunshine Coast went, oh, this is an opportunity for us to get some infrastructure spending. And when they secured the Olympics is not just in Brisbane, it's in the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. So the Sunshine Coast went, can we have some money, please? And they got a $27 billion infrastructure spend, which is when I bought that, as soon as I made that. But it's not just the infrastructure spending. Where are they spending it? And I looked at the plans, and the plans were that they were building a marina in Maroochydore to bring in the large cruise ships. They were expanding the Maroochydore airport so you could take international flights. They were updating all the roads and the transport so you could get from the top of the coast down to the bottom and then across to Brisbane quickly. So that changed the whole of Sunshine Coast, which is mostly full of tourist-grade accommodation, to new types of accommodation which were going to attract, because when you get all that infrastructure spending, you get a different demographic moving to the area. You get doctors, nurses, teachers, policemen, all these different professionals. They don't want to live in tourist grade or investment grade. So I ended up buying in Caloundra on the cliff a northeast facing apartment with a view of the sea, with a church in front of me, because that means it will never be built out, that view, for $535,000, and that is now worth a 1.3 or 4 now. So this is what infrastructure spending does. And then Gold Coast went, oh, hang on, we're getting left behind, and they went after their own money. So that becomes a compelling part of the equation when you're looking to source property, where the money's going. Anyway, everybody thought I was crazy buying up in the Sunshine Coast, and then it was one of the best performing areas for many years after.
It was around the home suburb or home city bias. So
yes.
Maybe just elaborate on, when you're working with people who come to you and say, oh, I want to build a property portfolio, but I want you to do it in my suburb.
Yeah.
How do you tackle that question or problem?
Yeah, most people buy because they want to drive past it. They like the salesperson or they like the brochure. None of those are very compelling reasons to buy. Some people buy because, for instance, they read in the paper that Hobart had 17% uplift a few years ago. And then I would lean forward and I go, let's unpack Hobart. I'm sorry, Tasmanians, because I think it's a great place to live if you don't mind the cold, and there's a beautiful community down there, and it's gorgeous. But from an investment point of view, there's only 5 employment clusters. and that is wood chipping, mining, tourism, fishing, and agriculture.
Probably education too with the universities down there.
Little bit. But none of them are sustainable in at a time where we're going through climate change, AI, and an economic downturn. So it's a great place to go and buy your principal place of residence. But my forte is choosing areas where you want to find an investment. So it is about a re-education. And I go right round when I'm working with a client. I give them an overview of my understanding about my reading of different areas, because I'd rather do that in an introductory meeting before they've actually put their hand in their pocket to engage me, because the last thing I want to do is to be working with a client for them to discover I have a different investment philosophy to what they're comfortable with. Much better for them to know that right in the beginning before they're committed, because I'm not going to be everyone's cup of tea. Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense, and that'd be the same in my industry and advice and so forth. Like I don't try to work with everyone. I want to work with people that are committed to understanding and learning my process and how that fits into a long-term strategy. And it's, not everyone can do that, and that's fine. That's okay. That's why we have a diversified, professional industry out there.
Well, you've actually just mentioned something which I love, and look, I'm old enough to say, I'm going to work. I know myself well. I love working with professionals in a transparent way, because I have a lot to learn as well, and I like transparency. Working in isolation as a buyer's agent without that transparency, first of all, that doesn't make me feel comfortable, because I could make a mistake. I don't want to be exposed. I don't want my client exposed. You get a better result in that way with the client as part of that team. But not everybody wants to be part of a team and go through that exercise. But I've found over the years, and this is the primary reason for it, because I've been through so many recessions, there's a very fine line. I don't like working with clients who want to abdicate their decisions. I want them to actually get to a place where they're educated and they're feeling 100% comfortable. Because there are people who go, oh, I want to delegate this to you, you sort it out, and I'll come back to you. That is a worry for me, because if things go wrong, I'll be the first person to blame. I much rather, because there's a very fine line between delegation and abdication. To me, that's an abdication. I want to work with people who are going to challenge me. I want to learn. I want to be part of a team. And you get the best results. I love that every time.
I like that philosophy. It's, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Delegation, abdication versus collaboration, I suppose, right?
Oh, yes. That's a missing piece.
That has to be. Yeah.
Has to be
there.
Yeah.
I want to talk about what can go wrong in all of this. We've been talking about, strategy, how to, where to look, some of the key things to look for, et cetera. Maybe thinking back on your career as a buyer's agent, what are some of the most expensive mistakes that people have made?
Well, I've been lucky. I got mentored by my dad, and then mentored by a lot of really smart people. So touch wood, I've made mistakes when I was younger for myself, but I haven't made the mistakes for my clients. I think also that's a byproduct of working as a team as well.
Let me rephrase that then. Maybe this is a better way to ask that question, is what mistakes have you seen in people's portfolios when they've engaged you to say maybe have a review of their portfolio, and you just look at it and go, oh my God, like that was a flaming pile of poo that they bought or whatever. Like what are some of the So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen?
Well, one that comes to mind, there's two that comes to mind, but one that particularly comes to mind is when I'm referred a client and they've already got an existing portfolio. It makes sense to me to review their portfolio to see whether the property is working for them or not, particularly when I hear little red flags like, I've got 4 or 5 properties and I don't have any money. Five old Sydney they're earning. Look, most of my clients are the mums and dads, and I have a whole chunk of people up in the high net worth clients as well, and I have some who are just trying to get into the industry. But this is someone who's earning $850 a year, and she didn't understand that old properties don't have depreciation. And also Sydney property, she bought in some great locations, but Sydney property doesn't have much yield because you have to put your hand so deeply down into your pocket to buy it. The rent in Sydney isn't very good. It's only around 2.5% yield compared to other Melbourne or Brisbane. So she has not had a holiday in years. So right now, I'm rejigging that whole portfolio for her. So that's a very common mistake. It's not unusual. I had a client who bought their principal place of residence. One of the little things that happen when you're a high net worth individual is every time your income goes up, it's very easy for your spending to creep up as well. And so they bought a beautiful house in Palm Beach, $16 million worth, and sent their kids to private schools, but had no money to go on holidays, no money to fix the house, no money to invest, and consequently no depreciation to wipe some of their tax or reduce some of their tax. So we sat down and we did a review, and I said, look, something has to give. Where do you want to live? And he said, Palm Beach. And so I said, what street? And he said, this street, which made it, I thought, more challenging. But by coincidence, there was a newer, more beautiful house on that street that was renting out for $2,500 a month. So he didn't even have the money to renovate his place. So what we did was we moved him into this newer place, and we did basic renovations on his property, which we got on the sale of the property. He sold the property. He's built an investment portfolio of property as well as shares and SMSF and a whole bunch of things that has depreciation, with a 5-year plan of selling some of that so they can buy their principal place of residence fully with cash without going in with non-tax deductible debt. And so sometimes you have to reverse engineer things. So if you're going to buy your principal place of residence, which everybody wants, in Sydney you have to be realistic about the suburb you want to start in. And if you want to buy in a good suburb, sometimes it's better off renting there and buying somewhere else where you get better capital growth and yield, and putting a plan in place so that you can eventually buy outright your principal place of residence, which I agree with you is a very, very important thing to do. But in Sydney, it's harder and harder for people to do that, especially young people, because young people want to live in the Beehive suburbs but can't afford to buy there, but can afford to rent there. So that's when we have to be nimble with the plan.
And they can definitely afford to live with mom and dad for longer, which is what we're finding is going on in the Beehive suburb, which is interesting. That question of, am I going to be able to buy a property, is on the lips, I dare say, of probably most 25 to 35, 40-year-olds in Australia. And my view of it is every generation has a problem that they have to confront. It will be something. And right now, this generation is confronting housing affordability. All you got to do is look at the budget, which we've already talked about, and all these programs that the government's trying to, promote schemes to help people buy property, as opposed to addressing the issue of supply. Let's, try to come up with all these magic, fixes that are magic bullets that are going to fix the problem. They're not, because all I think this stuff does really is drive the price up, which makes it harder for people to get into it, which is just ridiculous that, this argument or this conversation is being had.
And sadly, that's what's happening in the existing property market, sub 1.5, which is the first homeowners market. It's driving that price up because there's not much supply.
Yes. And wage growth is not, keeping up. We now have an insidious inflation problem with the price of oil. Where was I going with all this? I think I was going to maybe ask about, you said earlier that you think we're going to have a recession. I'm not disagreeing with that. I think we probably will. It'll be a function of a number of things. But tell me why and when you think that might actually begin. Because for those who are watching this, who might be those first home buyers, I guess that would probably be the time to potentially look at buying, is when we actually get a recession.
Well, it's a complex answer, because even though we might be going into a recession, we have inflation at the same time, which is a very tricky thing to navigate. The inflation is driven by two things: oil prices and lack of supply. And the government hasn't done a lot to address the lack of supply. And I think, well, first of all, when I bought my first home, I had 2.5 jobs. And I don't know if young people are prepared to do that these days. But what young people have that I didn't have at that time was a loan facility that can encompass a family guarantor, which can be helpful for the deposit. Plus, you can also secure the 40% government shared ownership scheme to help you get into property. The problem is the way the government has dealt with the supply issue has meant that and also with the incentives with the 5% deposit, it has pushed the 1.5%, pushed the sub $1.5 million properties up. So it's actually created the problem they were trying to solve. So I then go for those people, and if they're lucky enough to live at home, then perhaps rent vesting is the pathway for them, where they can actually get, for instance, buy an estate like Victoria. I strongly believe Melbourne is going to go through a growth spurt. It is, if you look at the median house price value, it's only just ahead of Darwin and Hobart, and yet it's going to be the biggest city in Australia by 2030. The reason it hasn't gone through that is twofold. One is the stamp duty exemption, which is fabulous for people trying to get into the property market. That's a saving of about, between 40 and 80 grand. But it's so because a lot of people are buying off the plan, because why would you buy an existing property and pay full stamp duty? Why not buy off the plan? So if you're not buying existing property, it's not showing there's many sales going on, which is not showing the median house price value go up. Plus, a previous premier encouraged a lot of investor-grade property to go in greenfield. That means new suburb around Melbourne, and they're so poorly designed and built that this government came in and said, if you want to continue as a landlord, you have to put your hand in your pocket to redo the insulation, put solar panels on, put water collection tanks, which has meant there's been an end of year David Jones sale for these investment grade properties, which has kept the median price down. But if you actually look at what's happening in Melbourne and all the infrastructure spending that's going on and all the grants that are being given to businesses to move down to Melbourne, the writing is on the wall that Melbourne, once we come out of this recession, will potentially go through a boom similar to what we experienced in Brisbane. And I called Brisbane back in 2012 when everybody said it wasn't going to happen, simply because I was seeing the infrastructure spending, which is what I'm seeing in Melbourne right now. So every city takes a turn for going through a boom. I think Brisbane will continue to go up, and Brisbane was really smart. Unlike Sydney, which built a special city called Homebush on a swamp, which has already got problems, structural problems, Brisbane learned from other cities and decided to encompass the Olympics into their city, as well as Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast, but build infrastructure that could be used by the demographics after. So that will continue to go up and up. I don't think you're going to see Brisbane crash down, simply because, again, they're running out of land, and we've got a construction increase because of inflation, and a lot of developers are pulled back at a time when they should be building more. So I think Brisbane and Melbourne are really compelling cities to invest into.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And so that, you mentioned rent vesting, which I will say I don't necessarily encourage that. I haven't had a strong enough argument until now to even recommend that to clients. And that's probably because there's a nuance around what you buy.
Yes.
And that's probably what I was missing, is that clarification of, well, you're not buying some cookie cutter piece of crap. You're actually buying a property that in, say, 5 to 7 years' time, you can sell to another owner-occupier. It's going to get a premium above market. And then obviously you can take that equity and use that to purchase your own property wherever it is that you want to live, hopefully, and have enough deposit and so forth. Which is a great nuance to get clarified and learn. So maybe I'll put rent vesting back on the agenda for my clients. And maybe I'll send them all to you to find them a property.
But also a lot of first-time owners are actually rent vesting with the plan of living in the place they're buying too, once that depreciation, the bulk of the depreciation runs out. Yes. And hopefully by that time we've had some capital growth, so that can either do that for them or they can leverage into something else,
We sort of, I started this conversation around the recession call and when that might happen. We sort of wandered off onto another topic, which was great. No, don't apologize. It was a good conversation. But I'll bring it back to the recession. When do you think we might see that unfolding?
I think we already are. I think it's a two-tiered economy.
Agree with that. They call it the K-shaped economy. That's a phrase. If you Google that, you'd hear that. And that's very much what's happening in the U.S. and other parts of the world. You have asset owners and holders who are getting richer in this environment, and people without assets or more liabilities who are getting poorer. And very much so. A technical recession, of course, is 2 quarters of negative GDP. And the stuff that I do and the work that I follow and do would suggest that Australia is probably going to get into that territory in mid-2027. So we're going to have a pretty good run, I think, until then. The wild card, of course, will be what happens with inflation. Inflation will continue to cause a lot of problems in the economy if it's not dealt with, which is very interesting because the way they deal with it is by raising interest rates, which has other flow-on effects. I mean, rates as they go up eventually get too high that it chokes off GDP and growth in the economy. And so then, of course, what do? They have to start cutting interest rates. And they usually do that around the time that we start to get those negative GDP reports. So back, I suppose that was a little
also
soliloquy for me. But
employment shift. I think we've got AI and the Iran war adding to this. I don't think I've ridden through a recession compared to this before. I think this is a very unique recession. We're very lucky to be living in Australia. But I think this recession is going to be very interesting. And I think the people who are nimble in this recession are the ones that are going to come out the top.
What does that look like, being nimble? What does that mean?
I think it means a lot of things. I think it's also, first of all, getting a good team of strategic advisors around you and managing your risks. There has to be 101. Looking at your industry, and if you are in an industry that's potentially going to be threatened by AI, how you can now, while you do have employment, how you can recalibrate your career. This will be a time where entrepreneurs can really rise to the top. You know, it's interesting what the budget's done to small businesses, unfortunately. But I do think that, you know, we could learn a lot from encouraging more entrepreneurship in Australia. We have so much talent here. And we keep losing it overseas, and it's time to wake up to a lot of that, and to become a draw card for other countries. And from many different angles, we are a draw card, but from a business point of view, we haven't been nimble enough on a government level. And I think that requires us to again, ask better questions of our politicians, spot the career politicians, which there seems to be an epidemic of right now, and start looking at the values that are driving politicians, because we need to come back to a time where we need to be more value driven. And I know that sounds very it's a very vague answer, but a lot of the reason we're in the state we're in right now is because we were interested in short-term bottom line. And right now, I'm still struggling to understand why gas companies aren't being taxed. That could have brought a lot more money in. Why a lot of corporates aren't being taxed properly. And you know, small businesses should be celebrated in Australia rather than corporations. And this is the time for it. This could be the making of Australia if we recognise it. Yeah.
There is I'm just trying to think of the title of a book that I've listened to recently. It's around tax and understanding what the tax code is all about.
Oh, I'd love to read that.
I'll check the title of it in a second. But until I read this book or listened to it, I didn't have any idea that the tax code, this is in the U.S., but I dare say it'd be very similar in any Western-style democracy like Australia, the U.S., etc. There's about 10 pages of the tax code that's usually hundreds and hundreds of pages long, about 10 pages of it that deals with how they're going to tax your income. The rest of the tax code is all about the incentives and the rules around what government is trying to incentivize industry and small businesses and et cetera to do to get tax credits, to get money from the government or whatever, and what industries they're trying to support. So I'll give you an example. In the US, it's two main things: energy and agriculture.
Good.
The tax code for years has been written to incentivize energy production. So drilling, production, the whole thing. And I did a search on chat about, well, what's the Australian tax code incentivize? And there's agriculture stuff in there, whatever. But to your point, and this is, I think, a really interesting thing to maybe, not that I have a large listenership on my podcast, but maybe this segment gets out there. And it is to say to the government, if you want, and I agree with you, Australia ought to be we should have capital flowing into this country to be deployed into things that are going to produce GDP, raise the level of income, raise the level of skill, entice people to come here because we're the only country in the world or one of a handful that does a thing. But that has to be incentivized through the tax code.
I agree.
And I haven't done enough research on this to really speak intelligently about it, but the very high level stuff that I did, really I can only see that agriculture is the thing, and probably property. I mean, obviously if you look at negative gearing and stuff, that has been incentivized through those mechanisms. But even now, they're attacking that.
Mm.
So you just have to wonder, what are our politicians actually doing and thinking about when they're making
Completely.
these decisions? Because I don't think they're the right ones. And I do fear for the future of Australia if things don't change around that.
I couldn't agree with you more. And all we have to do is look at places like Britain and what they've done with their taxes and how they lost so many, so much talent, so much business, and yet we did it here. And I keep going back to that definition of insanity. We need to look at it from more than just an accounting point of view. One of the countries that I've always been fascinated in is Bhutan, where I went there when I was 22, couldn't get over the border because it was closed to Westerners. But I loved their whole approach, which was triple bottom line happiness as well as triple bottom line success, financial success. So they focused on education and happiness as well as business. And I do think that we only focus on the bottom line and we keep getting short-term results, and it needs to be a little bit more evolved than it has been. And we want to be the country that everybody wants to knock on our door, and then we want to get the best of the best, the cream of the crop. We need to encourage immigration, not cut it back. We're all immigrants. Both our histories we've just explained. I think it's wonderful. We're richer for it, but we need to be discerning. And some of the government policies that I'm seeing implemented, it's great, the NDIS is being reviewed, but why not also review the medical system? Why not also review the energy system and review the education system? Because it's all very well and good getting more money from us, but are we using that money well enough? And I'm not a socialist, I'm a swinging voter. And I do love business. I think that's fantastic. And we have such a great education system. And even the fact that we're having a conversation about building an investment portfolio in a new country that needs to build, I go, how exciting is that? Then why do we cut ourselves off at the knees? Yeah. Yeah.
We could talk for another hour about that, I know, and maybe we will sometime.
Yeah.
We're getting close to the end of this, and it's been
Yeah.
wonderful having
Thank
a
you.
conversation with you. I want to hit you with a couple of quick rapid-fire questions to wrap it
Go
up,
for
because we talked a lot about some of these things, but it'd be good just to put a bow on top of this whole thing.
Sure.
What's one of the property myths that you wish would disappear?
Wouldn't disappear.
Would disappear.
Oh.
What's a myth about property that you wish would go away?
Oh, capital growth follows capital growth in land.
So that the land, because I hear this too, right? People go, well, the value's in the land. And I've even caught myself saying that. Or what is it? It's the land that goes up in value.
That's
Get rid of that
the
one.
past.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's a
Yeah.
biggie. That's
Yeah.
going to take a long time because
Yeah.
a lot of people are wed to that.
Yeah.
I'm not wed to it, but that's something that I believe was largely the case. Capital growth or cash flow?
Depends. Depends on your goals and circumstances. It's so important. If I was to say one way, then I'd be advocating a cookie cutter approach. There's lots of ways of building cash flow. Often it's a little bit of this and then a little bit of that, but it does depend on someone's circumstances.
Okay. Best sign a suburb has genuine long-term potential.
Beehive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
people want to
Infrastructure,
keep
Beehive,
coming back
yep.
and living there because it's got great infrastructure. You're in the city quickly. Yes, it's an exciting place to be.
We might wrap it up with this question, and that is, what should someone who's listened to this podcast ask a buyer's agent before they hire them?
How much experience have you had? And have you ridden through any recessions? And do you have a certain modality or speciality that you just buy house and land packages for people? Because you want someone who has diversification in the way they select properties for you. Otherwise, it's going to be cookie cutter. Yeah.
Good advice. Good
Yeah.
good way to end. There's a lot of people out there at the moment
Yeah.
advertising, becoming a buyer's agent and all this kind of stuff, and I just go, oh my God.
Yeah.
Gosh, help us.
I got into a cab a few weeks ago who told me he was a buyer's agent.
The cabbie did.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, part-time.
We must be getting near a recession then, because when that stuff starts happening either in the share market or clearly the
Correct.
property market,
Correct.
something's about to give.
Yeah.
Kahla, thank you very much for joining me on the Money Matters podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I've walked away myself with a new sort of way to look at property, and I think we're going to have a little off-air conversation about that. But thank you for
you.
joining me on the Money Matters podcast.
Thank you for the invitation, and it's been an honor being here with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.